So this lecture will cover physical development, brain development, and cognitive development, and some theories of development in infancy. Infants experience rapid and uneven growth during the first years of life. So the typical height and weight expectations are based on age and ethnicity. And newborns typically lose up to 10% of their body weight shortly after birth, but then they quickly regain it. There are two key patterns to growth. So the first is cephalocaudal development, and this is where growth proceeds from the head downward. And proximodistal development is where growth moves from the center of the body outward. And these patterns are influenced by health and environmental factors. And nutrition plays a critical role in this growth. So breastfeeding and complementary foods are two forms of nutrition for babies, and breastfeeding provides unique benefits. So including easier digestion for infants and lower rates of maternal depression. So it's linked to lower rates of depression in mothers. Breastfeeding practices are, however, influenced by factors such as socioeconomic status, race, and access to maternity leave. And so we see that in the US, Hispanic mothers breastfeed at higher rates than white mothers, who are more likely to breastfeed than Black mothers. Maternity care facilities in neighborhoods with Black mothers are more likely to provide insufficient education for breastfeeding, and so they are less likely to breastfeed within the first hour of birth. In addition, the employment settings could affect whether mothers decide to breastfeed. So in terms of low-income mothers, there are fewer resources to support breastfeeding, so there may be less private places or insufficient periods of time for women to use breast pumps. Overall, in the past several decades, we see that breastfeeding has increased in popularity in the US. In 1990, about half of mothers breastfed their babies. And in 2015, this rose to 83%, according to the CDC. And then nearly 2/3 of women continue to breastfeed after 6 months, and over 1/3 at 12 months. In the United States, breastfeeding rates are linked with the length of maternity leave. The US government mandates a 12-week unpaid maternity leave for all women, but many women are unable to afford unpaid maternity leave. Formula is a safe alternative, and these differences in outcomes are minimal. There is mixed evidence about whether breastfeeding influences cognitive functioning in children. So in some studies, research on the effects of breastfeeding on cognitive development show that infants that are breastfed for more than 6 months perform better on tests of cognitive ability compared with their formula-fed counterparts. But there are others that suggest that these differences in test scores are influenced by characteristics of mothers who breastfeed, such as higher levels of education and socioeconomic status. And then, there are complementary foods like formula. So as infants continue to grow, their reliance on milk declines, and then complementary foods are gradually introduced. So to support healthy weight in babies, the USDA advises avoiding sugary beverages before age 2. Excessive weight gain can happen in infancy, which can raise the risk of childhood obesity. And so it's recommended for mothers to especially avoid sugary beverages or even meals. So now we'll cover brain development and neural foundations during infancy. The brain is made up of billions of nerve cells, which are called neurons, and they allow us to sense the world, think, move, and function in everyday life. And neurons are different from other cells because they are built to communicate. And each neuron has dendrites. Dendrites receive messages, and axon sends those messages out. So those are the two differences between dendrites and an axon. So axon sends out information, whereas dendrites receive the messages. Neurons don't touch, so the messages travel across tiny gaps, and these tiny gaps are called synapses. So when an electrical signal reaches the end of an axon, it triggers chemicals called neurotransmitters to cross the synapse and pass the message to another neuron. Axons are covered with myelin. Myelin is a fatty coating that helps messages travel faster. Neurons also connect with muscles to control movement and with sensory cells to process information. Neurons begin forming before birth in a process which is called neurogenesis. And we are born with over 100 billion neurons. So as a brain develops, the neurons travel along glial cells. Glial cells support and guide the neurons to their current location. And this often is in the cortex, which is the brain's outer layer. After birth, the neurons rapidly grow and form thousands of new connections, or they form synapses, which is a process called synaptogenesis. Different parts of the brain develop at different times. The areas for breathing and survival come first, and then vision starts to happen around 3 to 12 months. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, typically develops last. So it continues into early adulthood where the prefrontal cortex is still developing, but it is the last aspect of brain development that does develop. The cerebral cortex is the wrinkled outer layer of the brain, and it makes up about 85% of its mass. So it's the outer brain layer, and it makes up 85%. It develops throughout childhood. So there's some areas that mature into early adulthood. The cortex is divided into 4 lobes, and they each have specialized functions. Sensory and motor areas develop first. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, self-control, and problem solving. And that develops more slowly, and it continues maturing into early adulthood. The cortex is also divided into 2 hemispheres, and it's connected by the corpus callosum, which connects the brain hemispheres together. Although both hemispheres contain the same lobes, they are not identical. And so through a process called lateralization, the hemispheres become specialized. So for most people, the left hemisphere controls language and the right side of the body. And then over time, one hemisphere becomes dominant, which is why most adults are left hemisphere dominant and right-handed. Experience plays a powerful role in shaping the brain, especially in infancy. So when you have stimulating environments, they strengthen brain growth by creating more connections. If you have a lack of stimulation, this can lead to smaller brain volume and lasting cognitive or perceptual deficits. And so during infancy, it's considered a sensitive period of development because experiences during this time are especially influential on development. And there are 2 ways of how experience impacts the brain. So one is experience expected development. And this refers to the brain's reliance on basic universal experiences such as hearing, seeing, and touching. And without these experiences, your normal brain connections may not form. So for example, infants that have untreated cataracts can lose vision in the affected eye. The other type of experience-based development is experience-dependent development. And this comes from individual learning experiences. And they're learning experiences that are unique to each child. Examples would be playing with toys, crawling or interacting with certain caregivers. And positive experiences like interactive play and responsive parenting can strengthen brain activity, especially in the prefrontal cortex. If a child has deprivation or trauma or negative experiences with interactions, this can cause long-term harm. So because certain experiences must occur during sensitive periods, missed opportunities can be difficult to reverse later in life. So now we're going to cover sleep in brain development and the influence on brain growth. So newborns sleep much more than adults. So adults average about 8 hours of sleep a day, maybe less, but newborns sleep 16 to 18 hours. And by 6 months, babies sleep about 12 hours. Other young animals also sleep more than adults, so research shows that sleep plays an important role in growth and development. In babies, sleep supports physical growth, brain development, and new connections between neurons. In adults, sleep helps the body repair itself and clear waste and strengthen memories. Sleep also has cognitive benefits. So in adults, poor sleep is linked to problems with attention, learning, and memory. And we have a special stage of sleep, which is called REM sleep. It's very important for thinking and memory. Adults spend about 20% of their sleep in REM, but infants spend about half. And so this suggests that REM sleep helps fuel early brain development. Babies that sleep poorly may have trouble with attention and self-control later on in childhood. So sleep is especially important during this time for infants. Despite the importance of sleep, infant sleep is often irregular. So newborns usually wake up every 2 hours to feed, and then they often continue nighttime waking for several months. There are some cultural views of infant sleep, and they vary. So in the United States, parents often aim for babies to sleep through the night, while many European parents see night waking as normal, and they focus instead on creating consistent routines. In Pacific Asian countries, children generally sleep about an hour less than in Western countries. Parents also influence infant sleep patterns. So that means babies are more likely to keep waking at night if parents play or engage with them during feedings, because since attention can reinforce this behavior, it's more likely that babies are going to sort of adapt to this schedule or life where if parents are interacting with them later, babies are more likely to stay up later. So I'm briefly going to go over Piaget's theory in cognitive development. This is one of another important theory regarding how infants process information in the world and make meaning out of it. So Piaget believed that children are active learners who build knowledge because they interact with people and the world around them. And through these experiences, they create schemas. Schemas are mental frameworks for understanding how things work. Through those experiences, there are basic reflexes. So schemas become basic reflexes like grasping or sucking. As children grow, these turn into more complex ideas and behaviors. So the schemas are always changing as children are learning new information. There's two key processes that drive this change. One is assimilation and two is accommodation. Assimilation means fitting new experiences into what we already know. So for example, a baby who knows how to suck on a rattle may use the same action on a new object, like a set of keys. And accommodation happens when that old schema no longer works or fits the new narrative. And so a child must adjust or create a new schema. So, for example, a baby that tries to suck on a beach ball but cannot fit it in their mouth will explore it differently. So they may squeeze it or, touch it. And so they're constantly fitting in new information. And if it doesn't work with the old schema, they will create a new schema to fit that new information. So Piaget said that children also seek cognitive equilibrium. And this is refers to as a balance between assimilation and accommodation, where their schemas match reality. Equilibrium is rare because most of the time kids experience disequilibrium or a mismatch between their ideas and the world. And this discomfort pushes them to adjust their schemas, which is how learning and growth happen. So over time, these processes are move children through the stages of cognitive development where they start to use more complex ways of thinking about things. And so, in the first stage of Piaget's theory, we call this the sensory motor stage from birth to 2 years. And this is where infants learn through their senses and actions. And so, to understand an object, they must see it, touch it, and explore it directly. At first, babies don't have mental images of things, so they must interact with them physically, and over time, their thinking develops across 6 substages. And so these stages are reflexes, which is the first stage, where babies are using their reflexes towards stimuli. So they may suck and grasp to learn, and they begin adjusting these reflexes to new objects. In the second stage, there is primary circular reactions from 1 to 4 months, and this is where babies repeat bodily actions that they feel good or interesting, like putting their hands in their mouth. And so they repeat motor actions that produce interesting outcomes. In the third stage, there's secondary circular reactions. So from 4 to 8 months, they are repeating actions with external effects. So repeating motor actions that can produce interesting outcomes that are directed towards the environment. And this is where infants start to learn how their actions and behaviors are affecting the outside world. In stage 4, we have coordination of secondary schemas from 8 to 12 months. And this is more goal-directed behavior that starts to form. And so this combines secondary circular reactions. Babies combine their secondary circular reactions to achieve goals and solve problems. And so it's the very beginning of intentional behavior. So for example, an infant can use one hand to lift a bucket that covers a ball and the other to grasp the ball. And infants use both hands to pull a string attached to a ball and eventually reach the ball. Tertiary circular reactions occur from 12 to 18 months. And this is where infants experiment with different actions to achieve the same goal or observe the outcome and make new discoveries. So this is more of trial and error exploration. An example would be if a toddler hits a pot with a wooden spoon and listens to the sound, then hits other objects in the kitchen, such as the refrigerator, to hear the sound that the spoon makes against those objects. Mental representation occurs in the last stage, stage 6, from 18 to 24 months. And this is where toddlers start to have internal mental representation of objects and events. They start to learn how to think to solve problems rather than relying on trial and error. So for example, when they're confronted with a problem, like a toy that's out of reach on the counter, toddlers consider possible solutions to a problem in their mind, and then they decide on that problem and solution, and then they start to implement it. So researchers have tried to evaluate the sensory motor reasoning, and they've tried to challenge whether Piaget's theory holds in infancy. And Studying infants' thinking is very difficult because they can't talk and they can't fill out questionnaires. And so instead, researchers have to use various methods um, for understanding whether infants can form mental representations and whether they actually do form object permanence. But they have to rely on observing behaviors directly, like how long babies look at certain events. And these methods have supported some of Piaget's ideas, but they've also challenged others. So, for example, Piaget believed that infants can't form mental representations until late in the sensory motor stage. Research using tasks on object permanence and imitation shows that infants may have these abilities earlier than Piaget originally thought. So, one method is through the violation of expectation tasks. So, Piaget tested object permanence by asking infants to uncover hidden objects. But younger infants may understand that an object is still there, even if they lack the motor skills to show it. So to study this, researchers use looking time tasks. And in these tasks, babies are made to see an expected event that follows physical rules and see an unexpected or impossible event that breaks the physical rules. If infants stare longer at the impossible or unexpected event, it suggests surprise and an understanding of the physical law. So there was a study back in 1987 that showed the 4.5-month-olds did look longer when a drawbridge appeared to pass through a hidden box. And this did suggest that they likely remembered the box even when it was out of sight. Piaget also studied object permanence using the A not B task. So in this task, infants repeatedly find a toy in one spot. That one spot can be place A. And when it's moved to a new spot, like place B, they often still search at place A. And Piaget thought this showed they lacked object permanence. However, later studies suggest infants may know the toy is at place B, but they struggle to stop themselves from reaching towards place A because of immature motor control or habits. So looking time versions of the task show that infants are surprised when the toy is found in the wrong place, and this could suggest that they do in fact understand object permanence earlier than Piaget believed. Another way to test infants' mental representation is deferred imitation, which is the ability to copy an action after a delay. So Piaget believed that children under 18 months could not do this. But the research shows that even very young infants can imitate after a delay. So, for example, 6-week-olds can repeat an adult's facial expression a day later, and 6 to 9-month-olds can copy unique toy actions after 24 hours. And these findings suggest that memory and representational abilities develop gradually, not in sudden stages. The other way is core knowledge theory. So core knowledge theory posits that infants have innate knowledge systems. While Piaget emphasized learning through sensory motor experience, many researchers argue that infants are born with some built-in knowledge. They have babies have this come equipped with basic understanding of the physical world. And they have a basic understanding of numbers and patterns that help them learn quickly. So there is a system in place, a built-in knowledge system in place, where babies already have the tools to understand basics of the world around them. Studies using looking time methods show that infants expect objects to be solid not disappear, and follow gravity. They also noticed numerical differences, such as between large and small groups. Critics note that looking time may reflect simple discrimination rather than true understanding, but the overall evidence shows that infants are active learners and they're constantly building on inborn capabilities. And so overall, Piaget's work shaped our understanding of cognitive development, but modern research is now showing that infants are more capable than what Piaget thought originally. They demonstrate early memory, object permanence, and even numerical knowledge. And this suggests that cognitive growth is a continuous dynamic process that's shaped by both innate abilities and experience. So now lastly, we'll cover information processing theory. So this theory posits that our cognitive development is a set of interrelated components that permit people to process information. So it allows people to notice, take in, manipulate, store, and retrieve information. And newborns are ready to learn and adapt to their world because they are born information processors. And so we have several memory systems in place. And our sensory memory is a storage unit that briefly holds incoming sights and sounds. And so everything in the outside world, we take it into our sensory memory. So it's this brief storage of sensory input. It typically holds this information from the outside world for a fraction of a second to a few seconds. So it's a very quick, brief memory storage, and its information is only processed for a fraction of a second at a very minimum. So when we pay attention to certain information, it then moves into our working memory, which is another system where we actively process and manipulate the information. Typically in working memory, we are using the information for thinking, problem solving, and decision making. Now, working memory is limited in capacity and duration. And so a lot of times we tend to hold 5 plus or minus 2 items. So working memory is very limited in capacity, but it can improve with brain development. The central executive directs attention and coordinates cognitive processes, which is a function known as executive function. So it directs attention and problem solving. And so we need attention in order to process the information we're receiving and then problem solve or think about the information and then make a decision. And then information that is rehearsed and processed in working memory can enter long-term memory, which is a large storage unit where information is kept indefinitely. And long-term memory tends to emerge early on as well. So recognition and deferred imitation studies show that young infants can remember events, actions, and objects for days, weeks, or even months. And these abilities become more complex and durable with age. Memory develops gradually. So infants tend to show sensory memory developing at birth. They begin to demonstrate working memory around 5 to 6 months. And they improve their ability to recall objects, features, and sequences over the first 2 years of life. Attention is the ability to focus awareness, shift it when needed, and select information for processing in working memory. And these skills are shaped by neurological development. Infants' attentional abilities change rapidly during the first year and continue to develop throughout childhood. Attention develops by 10 weeks. So about 10 weeks of age, infants are showing noticeable improvements in their attention. And as their attentional capacity increases, they tend to have more of a preference for more complex stimuli. So for example, in one study of infants that were ages 3 to 13 months, looking time varied with stimulus complexity. And so looking at simple dots drew less attention, faces drew moderate attention, and video clips drew the most attention. Looking time peaked at 14 weeks and then declined, which reflected growing efficiency in processing visual information. And so, with improved attentional control, infants require less exposure to become habituated. Attention is also linked to brain development and heart rate changes. So, physiological measures like heart rate provide evidence of attention. So, heart rate tends to arise or increase when infants first notice a stimulus. It tends to plateau when they are sustaining attention and then return to baseline once their attention fades. Brain development also plays a key role. So at 5.5 months, infants show widespread prefrontal cortex activity when they're engaged in attention tasks. At around 7.5 months, this activity becomes more localized and signals improved neural efficiency. So attention supports not only perception, but it also supports memory and learning. Long-term memory is based on recognition and deferred imitation. So recognition memory is the ability to identify previously encountered stimuli, which emerges early on. Newborns can recognize both visual and auditory stimuli. And with age, infants require fewer exposures to encode information and can retain it for longer periods. Deferred imitation demonstrates long-term memory as well. So in tasks of imitation, infants observe a novel action with an unfamiliar object, and then they're later tested to see if they can reproduce it. And results show that infants can form memories lasting months or even a year. Infants also tend to remember longer sequences of actions as they get older, and so they need fewer demonstrations and they can retain information over longer delays. So for infants, the world is full of new insights and experiences. And to make sense of it all, they begin to form categories or groups of similar things, which is known as grouping stimuli. Categorization helps infants store information in memory, retrieve it easily, and recognize new things that belong to familiar groups. And so without categories, every new object or event would feel completely unfamiliar. So researchers study infant categorization, and they use methods like habituation to understand how babies categorize things and whether they actually can early on. So for example, if babies are shown many fruits, like apples and oranges, and then see a cat, they often look longer at the cat. So it shows that they are recognizing it as different from the fruits. So at first, between 1 to 4 months, infants start to group objects based on shape, size, and color. Between 6 to 7 months, they can start using conceptual categories, so they start grouping things by function or behavior. Between 7 to 12 months, infants sort objects into many everyday categories, like food, animals, vehicles, and furniture. Brain studies show that their activity patterns change when they see something new, and that further supports their growing ability to categorize. By 12 to 30 months, infants first group objects broadly and then more specifically. And through daily experiences, infants start to become better at recognizing similarities. And then they start using categories to think and solve problems. Overall, attention, memory, and categorization steadily improve over the first 3 years, and they start to shape intelligence and cognitive growth. And these skills develop through brain maturation and through the environments and experiences that infants are exposed to. Theories of infant thinking often focus on how babies build new ways of understanding the world or on how attention and memory develop. But a common criticism of these approaches is that it doesn't fully consider the role of context and culture. And the context is social and cultural settings in which infants grow up. Infants' thinking is shaped By their own abilities, yes, but also by the ways caregivers and communities interact with them. And caregivers play an important role in teaching infants. So in Western cultures, parents are often guiding infants' learning with visual cues. So they'll point or they'll make eye contact. But in a lot of non-Western cultures, there is an emphasis on physical closeness rather than face-to-face play. In some cultures, like the Mayan community, infants learn by watching others and paying attention to several events at once instead of being directly taught. And some studies show that cultural differences in how caregivers interact with infants influence how babies pay attention and learn. So today, digital media is a major part of infants' environment. And the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time for children under 18 to 24 months. Screen exposure is linked with risks such as poor sleep, language delays, and weaker self-control. There are a lot of baby videos that are marketed as educational, but the research shows little evidence that they improve learning. So for example, one study found that babies that regularly watched a popular DVD program did not perform better in language or intelligence than other infants. So based on the research, infants learn best through direct interaction with caregivers and not from digital media. And so overall, media is much less effective than human interaction for learning. So, and this is partly due to the video deficit. So babies typically struggle to transfer what they see on a screen into real life skills. When parents watch videos with their infants and talk about the content, children pay more attention and they do learn more. So this again shows that social interaction still remains a key part of how infants learn in a digital world.